New Orleans, a city of mystery, a city that 1 million people proudly call home, at least the ones above ground, because New Orleans is also home to many beings that can't find their way back. Watch as our group of paranormal investigators attempt to discover these lost souls. Join us as we explore New Orleans, the most haunted city in America.
The word poltergeist means noisy ghost, and in tonight's episode, we've selected 4 of the most active poltergeist hauntings that we've ever encountered. Things that go bump in the night. That's tonight on Haunted New Orleans.
One of the strangest situations I ever encountered was when I was asked to do an investigation in what was once the Witchcraft Museum in New Orleans on Dumaine Street. They were having a lot of problems, a lot of poltergeist activities with things moving around the store. 2 of the mannequins that they had in the store that represented a god and a goddess were literally throwing their arms off, according to the proprietors, and falling off of their pedestals. They believed that the activity was due to a box that contained supposedly a demon. It was a wooden box that was hand carved and had elaborate strappings of leather around it and covered in wax. Supposedly, the demon was captured by Dr. Raymond Buckland after he performed an exorcism on a man that was possessed by this particular demon. The demon was put inside the box, sealed up, and given to the museum as a relic. According to the proprietors, this box was vibrating and sometimes voices were heard coming out of it as if the demon was trying to escape. The owners believed that the poltergeist activity inside the museum was literally caused from this particular box. So I did an investigation on the box itself. I went in, I took the box, I shook it, I slammed it down, I yelled at it, and then I left it alone. Put a recorder next to it and went away for a couple of hours. When I returned and listened to the recording, it sounded as if a disembodied voice yelled out my name 3 times. The building on the corner of Royal and St. Peter Streets was once the location of the Royal Cafe, but in the 1800s it was the Lebranche family home. Like many Frenchmen, Monsieur Lebranche had a mistress on the other side of town. Her name was Melissa. Unbeknown to him, Madame Lebranche was fully aware of the affair. When he passed away, she invited the young woman over for tea. Unwittingly, Melissa accepted the invitation, not realizing what lay ahead for her. Madame Lebranche put some sort of drugs inside the tea, knocking her out. Once unconscious, the bitter woman dragged the younger woman up the stairs, dragged her up to the attic where she chained her up. Now, for whatever reason, they say that Melissa was wearing wooden shoes at the time. So the legend of Melissa also says that when she awakened, she was so frantic that she stomped her feet until her shoes literally broke off. Melissa eventually died from starvation and dehydration in the hot attic above what is now the Royal Cafe. During the time it was the Royal Cafe restaurant, on the 2nd floor, customers oftentimes saw the figure of a barefoot young woman racing through the restaurant, sometimes being chased by an older woman dressed in black. Madame Lebranche makes sure that Melissa stays to the confines of her 3rd floor attic. She was a bitter woman in her life and an even more evil ghost in the afterlife.
This is Haunted New Orleans. You're watching Haunted New Orleans.
Ethel DeChamps in the 1840s was a very colorful character in New Orleans. He was a very famous, very well-known magician, hypnotist, but he was also into what at that time was considered the spiritual, meaning that he liked to play with the psyche. He liked to hone in on his powers of persuasion, his powers of being able to draw energy. You see, he's doing these experiments on the psyche, and he believed that the best source of this raw energy was in the youth and vitality of children. He did his experiments using drugs, using hypnotism, It's clear that he was a very persuasive individual because he was able to persuade his friends to allow him to do his experiments on their children, these late afternoon sessions back in his office. His favorite subject was a young girl named Juliet Dietz. His initial experiments went very well, but then when things didn't go exactly as he wanted them to, he would get very upset, violent even. It's beyond me why the parents continued to let her take part in these sessions, but they did, which shows how powerful of a person he was in terms of being able to get people to do what he wanted them to do. So one particular afternoon, Juliet's sister passes by Etienne's shop, and what she saw shocked and horrified her. She runs back home and she grabs the parents. They grab the police and they come back by and they see just how badly this experiment went. Juliet's dead, and they see that Etienne is in a great fit of anguish over this. He is standing over her. She's laid out on this table. He had his shirt off and he had a knife and he was repeatedly slashing at his own flesh. When he was finally subdued, he was arrested, he was tried, he was convicted. These wounds were mentally inflicted somehow, but in any case, he was executed. This was quite some time ago. This is in the 1840s. To this day, in that restaurant, which now stands where his shop was, Juliet is quite present. And this is a very popular restaurant with tourists, with locals. It's in a perfect location. The people that work there, they say they still see her in these hallways. She's so present there that anything that goes wrong is basically blamed on her. Things go missing. They're usually found elsewhere in the restaurant, intact. She doesn't keep anything. We think she's merely curious. She's seen in hallways. Apparently, to be alone in any of those back rooms or storehouses is pretty much asking for it. But what's even more interesting is that people report hearing their names being spoken. But what's more disturbing than this, in all of these cases, it's clear that she is present, aware of her surroundings. She's actually interacting with people, but it's very common. People walk into this back room that we assume is Etienne's own private quarters. Several people have reported walking into this room to see this scene of rage play itself out. Juliet on the table, man over her, reacting very angrily, almost violently. And this is very sad. I mean, clearly this little girl who is still there is very traumatized to this day by what happened almost a century ago, and she keeps reenacting this nightmare so powerfully that people are actually able to witness it.
Stay tuned for more Haunted New Orleans. Haunted New Orleans. We'll be right back.
The story of Julie is probably one of the most tragic love stories in the city of New Orleans. Julie was a young girl. She had entered into Plaçage at the age of 17 with a man whose name was Michi. Plaçage was an arrangement that was very common practice in New Orleans in the 17 and 1800s, where a white man would often take a woman of mixed heritage as a mistress. He would support her, buy her house, take care of her children, send them to school, and usually leave a good portion of his estate to her in his will. Most places ended up in a small Creole cottage, usually 1.5 or 2-story cottage at the edge of town. Julie got a mansion and everything a woman could possibly want. She had the finest clothes, the finest jewelry, a man who loved her very much, and a place in society, but she wasn't happy. There was one thing that Julie wanted more than anything that she couldn't have, and that was a wedding ring. It was the one thing she couldn't have because the law forbade it, and Michi had a wife. But about 2 years into their arrangement, Michi's wife died. And Julie did start out, innocently enough, here and there, asking, would you marry me? And proposing marriage to Michi pretty much at every turn. This goes on till about December, which is a very important time of year for a guy like Michi. This is the time of year he has a little business get-together, invites his current and prospective associates to the house, get to know one another personally. The problem with Michi's party was he had planned it so far in advance he didn't realize that it was going to be that one day a year was actually cold in New Orleans. Not only was it cold, but it was raining, and people didn't want to venture out in this bad weather. He's really stressed out about it. He's worried. He's looking out the window praying that the weather will change, but Julie goes by and sees that he's trapped in a room, and she has his attention. So she does one of these. She blocks the doorway and goes, Michi, why don't you marry me? He says, sweetie, this isn't a good time. I'm under a lot of stress. Our entire financial future depends on this party. Can we talk about this tomorrow? She's 19 at this point. She says, no, I want to talk about it right now. So under all that stress, he makes a suggestion he believes to be so absurd that no lady would ever accept it. He says, you want to marry me? Fine, I'll marry you on one condition. Take off all your clothes. Go sit on the roof in the freezing rain till dawn to prove your love for me. If you're still there in the morning, I will marry you regardless of the consequences. Julie was shocked. She slams the door in his face, stormed off to the guest bedroom, and slammed that door too for good measure. She's like, great, now I have to have an argument. So he goes after her to calm her down. Halfway to her room, though, his guests arrive. He starts hearing knocks downstairs. He goes to answer the door, figuring out this argument could wait till later. His party goes off well. He makes all of his connections he expects to make, and he's going to be very wealthy for the coming year. Right before dawn, he sends all of his guests home and rushes upstairs to share all the good news with Julie. I can't find her anywhere, and you can't figure where she could have gone. Then he remembers, oh, God, we had that argument, and I made that suggestion. Could she have done that? He rushes up to the roof, goes out the dormer, and sure enough, there are her clothes right there. He gets out on the roof. He slips. He almost falls off. He looks over just in time to see Julie huddled against the chimney for warmth. She is naked, she's cold, she's wet, she's very dead. He's heartbroken. He rushes down to the police, gets the police. They take her to the hospital. She's pronounced dead on the scene, and they do an autopsy to determine the cause of death. During the course of the autopsy, they find that she was 6 months pregnant with their first child. It's why she was obsessed with marriage. His business was not so important anymore. Instead, he put all of his attention into the bottle. He managed to drink himself to death within a year, almost the day of Julie's death. His ghost used to be very active on the premises. He hasn't been seen much in the last 40 years, and nobody really knows why. We don't know if he moved on to the light or reincarnated or followed somebody home. Julie, on the other hand, is by far the most predictable ghost in the city of New Orleans.
She still exists, her spirit. You know, the spirit never dies. But she still roams around up and down all 3 stories of the building. Sometimes you can hear her giggle. She has this sweet smell of gardenia. Things can be very, very still, and you can smell this.
At one time, we were in the patio working on some doors, and we had the stairway going from the patio to the slave quarters blocked up. Every time I would bend over, lean over the door to work on it, it felt like somebody was behind me, and I kept on looking to the side, looking around, and my helper was wondering, what was I doing? And I would ask him, what do you want to get around me? And he said, I'm over here. So it was kind of creepy.
She's also very active the rest of the year on the premises. Apparently, Julie did not get the memo that this is now 4 apartments and a business. Over the years, it's been a bottom of the cup tea room, it's been an art gallery, it's been a frame shop, and hundreds of reports of poltergeist activity have come into us over the years. From ladies' hair doing this while they're looking at art or getting the cards read, their dress is moving, the lady's fingers running her hands down a man's back.
We finally finished with the piece, and we moved and cleared the stairway so you could go up. And right then I could feel somebody go around my back, and I felt the hair on my arms go up, the hair on my back go up. And as we looked up the stairway, we saw Julie turning the corner, running up the stairway. So, that was just an unbelievable experience.
She always let her things be known that she was around, especially if she was very angry. When she was very angry, the swing out in the patio would go round and round and round.
It's a child's swing, and any time over the years that it's been tampered with, the poltergeist activity in the house does increase.
But it's never been anything bad there. She's always been very polite, very nice ghost, so nobody's ever had a bad experience with her.
Every year on the coldest night of December, she will appear naked on that roof, waiting for Mishi to keep his promise. Every year, the police get a bunch of phone calls from tourists talking about naked women committing suicide at Royal in Orleans. And they used to come out with the fire trucks. After a while, they started figuring out what was going on. So now when y'all call, they say, oh my God, we'll get right on that. Because they get the same phone calls every year.
This is Haunted New Orleans. You're watching Haunted New Orleans.
The Sultans Palace is also known as the Laprete House. It was built by a man named John Baptiste Laprete in 1835. He was a wealthy planter at a plantation in Plaquemines Parish and only used this house as his opera season house. They're common back then for people with plantations upriver, especially rich planters, to have a house in the city. So he built one of the more elaborate houses just for the winter season, for Mardi Gras season, for opera season. In the early 1850s, he was approached by a man who represented himself to be the agent of a Turkish sultan. He made a good offer to rent the house. Laprete didn't use it all the year, so he agreed to rent this house to this man. And the sultan moved in. His name was Prince Suleiman. He came in with an elaborate entourage and all the things you would imagine a Turkish sultan to have. Now, it wasn't unusual back then, at the height of this city's wealth and prosperity, for strange exotic characters to come live here. For the first few months of his residence, the Sultan became one of the more colorful characters in New Orleans history. He threw elaborate parties. Back then, if you had a lot of money, it was your obligation, your duty, to entertain society. And since he was a colorful, interesting character, the who's who of Creole society would always go to his parties, and it was the best of everything. They were exotic. It was different. He was surrounded by an entourage of eunuchs, men with scimitars, turbans on, wearing harem pants and exotic costumes. And that went on for a little while. But after a few months of this, he stopped throwing these parties, and no one got in. No one was ever invited to the Sultan's place again. But all the stories were the same thing, that Prince Suleiman was indulging his every hedonistic whim. Boys, girls, opium, strange music, every possible indulgence that he could find went on inside that house. Now, it's reported that the Sultan used to go down to a place we still have at Toulouse and Bourbon Street called the Dungeon. That's where he would bribe, entice, outright kidnap beautiful young men and women, bring them back and beat them into his harem. But then after 2 years, one morning, it was just quiet. No noise, no incense, no opium, no nothing. And a girl walking down the sidewalk that morning passed underneath the gallery, where she felt something drip on her shoulder. Thinking it was water, she went to brush it off, looked at her fingers, and saw her fingers covered in blood. Blood was dripping from the gallery. She went to the front door and saw blood pooling from under the front door. So naturally, being terrified, she ran and got the police. The police came down and had to batter the door down from the outside because it was locked from the inside. What they found inside of that house was a bloodbath. Blood and guts, gore in every room of this place. Limbs stacked up, they couldn't match the limbs to the bodies. They didn't know who went with what. At least 3.5, 4 dozen people were brutally raped, murdered, mutilated. There's a famous old chandelier in that house. They say they found a torso hanging in the chandelier. Every last surface covered in blood. They searched and searched and couldn't find the Sultan. Finally, they searched the side yard. In the side yard, they found a hand sticking out of the ground. Dirt under the fingernails. When they looked a little closer, they found the Sultan, buried in a shallow grave. Dirt was shoved down his esophagus. He had been buried alive. No one knows what happened. Most of the speculation revolves around his brother, because Prince Suleiman was Prince Suleiman. He was not the Sultan. His father had been the Sultan. When his father died, his older brother became the Sultan. Back then, the first thing you did when you accepted the crown as royalty, especially in that culture, was to kill off all competition for your male heirs. So, it's not far-fetched to think that the older brother sent mercenaries in the night to kill the younger brother. Now, for many years after that, 100 years most people say, a date palm grew in the site of his grave. It was called Père Antoine's date palm. Père Antoine was a famous old priest here. He owned the property this house sat on, originally. But it was a nasty, gnarled up tree. Date palms are usually great, stately, beautiful trees, bore a lot of fruit. This was a nasty, curved, gnarled, short tree that never bore fruit. And they said in this town, if you sat under that date tree, if you sat under the Sultan's palm, you would be cursed. It's apartments now, so I understand that there are rooms available in this place. So if you like to live there, call the landlord. But as we say in New Orleans, you pays your dollar, you takes your chances.
Thank you for joining us for this episode on poltergeist activity. Be sure to tune in next week as we explore more of haunted New Orleans.